I guess we're going to have a song request. Oh, there he is. I was going to say, how long you have to wait for a professor? 10 minutes. A preacher is 5, isn't it? Or no? Okay. All right. We're going to sing number 483 and 489. Footsteps of Jesus. We're going to sing the first and last, and then Lord, I want to be a Christian, all four. So would you stand and sing with us? Number 483 is first, Footsteps of Jesus, first and last stanza. Would you join us? Join us now as we welcome each other to our service.
We're getting ready to take our prayer concerns, but one of the things I want to check with you first about is, does anybody need the chart that we handed out last time that we came together? It has the, okay, you got a couple back there, and so Ken's going to bring those to you right now as we get started. It's a sort of a gauge, as the best way to put it, or a chart that shows you sort of the where a particular translation of the Bible lands on a scale between being very close to the original language to as far over on the right of that to on that chart to being a paraphrase. And so if you stuck yours in your Bible last time, then tonight the translation that we're going to be looking at is the NLT, the New Living Translation. And so you can look at it on your scale on your chart there. And I am looking. I thought I had one in my. Ken, if you have an extra one, I'll take it. I thought I had one in my stuff. But so tonight we are going to get started by taking your prayer concerns and. we'll get into our study tonight. And as I said, probably the easiest place, like most times, is Deuteronomy 6:5, a scripture that is known as the Shema or Shema by the Jews, is one of the verses that we will be comparing, looking at other translations tonight. And so tonight we are looking at the New Living Translation as we try to determine what is best for us as translations, as we're trying to figure which one is the right one to choose and which one fits us best. So let me ask you, how many of you use or have a copy of the New Living Translation? We've got a couple, 2 or 3. You got one, okay. And so we have some that use it. And so as we get started tonight, that's the translation that we're going to be looking at. And so we're going to dig into it a little bit tonight and learn some interesting things. And as I said, it's the New Living Translation. And as always, we're going to look at the translation method and the reading level. The translation method for this particular translation is the thought for thought. So what that means is, rather than saying, like this morning, I had you say the Greek word pale, right? And so pale means struggle in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. Well, instead of saying that it is the word pale and it means struggle or wrestle, as we talked about this morning, but pale being an exact match for the word struggle, when it comes to a thought for thought, what they would do is they would take the entire verse, and if there were thoughts that were meant in the word, like I said today, that it was that wrestling where you would be pinned and held by the throat, is what that word pale means. What they would do is, in some certain cases, definitely what they would do is try and relay that thought rather than say struggle or wrestle or something like that. And so it's more the thought of what is being shared than the specific word for word exchange, like you would when you're trying to translate something. And that's a little hard to explain, but when we look at some verses here in just a little bit, you'll see what we're talking about. It's a lot simpler than I'm explaining it here. One really good aspect of the New Living Translation is its reading level. The reading level is 6th grade. And so not that it means that, again, that you have to be on a 6th grade reading level to understand it. It means that it is understandable very easily. It's understandable to even a 6th grader. And so that's a good thing, because most adults are able to read on a much higher level. But what that means is that that the reading and the comprehension of what is in that translation is not difficult to understand. And that's good, because what we want from any translation is that it's easy for us to understand and to dig into the truths of God's Word. As far as when this translation was done, the original release was the year I got my driver's license, 1996. And so this is a really young translation, I would say. But it's only 27 years old. And so that's it's just a point of fact. It's a newer translation, and we've been going from 1611 with the King James version. We're already to the mid 90s, and we're going to continue getting newer and newer with the other translations that we're looking at. Interestingly, though, you see there that in 2004, 7, 13, and 15, meaning 4 times in the last 27 years, that translation has been revised, or there's been revisions. And we'll talk a little bit about those revisions a little bit later, because those revisions, well, I'm not sure that we will, but those revisions, other than 2004, most of the revisions in 07, 13, and 15, those revisions were minor grammatical changes. So even though it's viewed as a revision, it was changing more the grammar, not the grammar, the punctuation and grammar, I guess you would say, in places in this translation. So when it comes to this particular translation, we're also looking at the translators. There were 90 translators, which is almost double what was with the King James Version, but also a lot less than some of the other more modern translations. Some of them having 115 or 130 translators. And this one sort of falls in the middle of the road with the number of translators being 90. Now, the sponsor of the New Living Translation is Tyndale House Publishers. If you remember last time when we looked at the New King James Version, what we found there was that the sponsor there was Thomas Nelson Publishers, which has been bought out by some other group, and I still can't remember what it is. But Tyndale House is the group that produces the New Living Translation. And so that is the publisher or the sponsor for that. Now, as always, we want to say, okay, if this is a translation of the Bible, what was their source? What did they use to give us or provide us with this translation? And if there is an English Bible that they leaned on, what was that Bible? And so the first one we see here is the English Bible that the New Living Translation leaned on was the Living Bible. Now look on your chart, and what does it tell us about the Living Bible? Is it on that chart? It is a paraphrase. It's not a translation, word for word or thought for thought, but the Living Bible is a paraphrase. And we've talked about paraphrases, and paraphrases will be the last translation that we look at when it comes to our study. But paraphrases, again, are exactly that. It is a paraphrase. You know, today, when I was preaching this morning on spiritual warfare, and I told you this is a paraphrase, the Reader's Digest version, a condensed version of what Paul is saying in Ephesians 6:12, is that there is a struggle going on between those of us in the physical realm and those in the spiritual realm. That is Pastor Nick's paraphrase of Ephesians 6:12. Okay? Now, does that mean that I went and pulled word for word, every word out of the original Greek and made it word for word or thought for thought? No. That's my view of how to interpret that particular set of text. Well, the Living Bible has done the same thing. Like all other paraphrases, it is a paraphrase. It's not word for word. It's not thought for thought. And so when it came to the Living Bible, it was produced in 1971. This isn't on the screen. It's just additional information. The Living Bible was produced in 1971, and it was based off of the American Standard Version, which is also the one that the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, was done off of. And so that was when the Living Bible was done. Well, they looked to do sort of a revision, if you want to call it that, of the Living Bible, and instead of doing another paraphrase, they tried to make it a translation. And so they went to the Greek and Hebrew text and all of that to give us the New Living Translation. So that's where that comes from. But we also know that they had to, if they're doing a translation and not particularly a paraphrase, they would still have to use Old Testament text and New Testament text. And so when it comes to the Old Testament Hebrew text that they used for the New Living Translation, they used some that we've become familiar with through this study. They used the Biblia Hebraica, which is the Hebrew Bible. They used the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were available. The Septuagint, which is if you remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from 2 millennia ago. Then the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation of the Hebrew. And then they have two new ones that we've not seen before, the Syriac Peshitta and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, I'd heard about the Samaritan Pentateuch before, and I knew what that was. I did a little checking to make sure I was square on what I knew about that. But the Syriac Peshitta is, let me make sure I get this right, it is a Hebrew Bible that was translated into a Syriac Aramaic dialect back in the 300s AD. So it is a translation from Hebrew into Aramaic from 1700 years ago. So that's one of their references, is a very old text that was written in basically southern Turkey, northern Syria region. The Samaritan Pentateuch is exactly what you might think if you know a little bit about the Bible. Samaritan, the northern region of Israel from Samaria and all of that. This Pentateuch, which is the five first five books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, as you sometimes hear it called, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those five make up the Torah or the Pentateuch, the five books. And the Samaritans had a translation of the Hebrew Bible written into their Samaritan language. And when they did, it's kind of interesting that even as old as the Samaritan Pentateuch is, which is like 2,000 years old or older, the interesting thing is there are changes to the books of Moses, which those are, the Pentateuch. There are changes in the Samaritan Pentateuch that are key changes to the biblical text. And one of those particularly, there's not a whole lot of them, there's a few of them, but one of them is that that in the Samaritan Pentateuch, readers are told that they are to worship in Jerusalem or on Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. And what does Jesus tell us in John chapter 4 when he's talking with the woman at the well, and she is a Samaritan woman, and she makes the comment to Jesus, you Jews say we're supposed to worship where? In Jerusalem. But we worship on Mount Gerizim. It's kind of interesting that even in 2,000 or 3,000 years as this has been available to the Samaritans, they actually changed that to make it say that they're supposed to worship on Mount Gerizim. But nevertheless, the Hebrew that it is involved with in some of the text make it still a very good resource, even though you know that there are certain things like that that are not kosher, so to speak, no pun intended. But we would still be able to use it from a grammatical standpoint, and there are a lot of things in there that are very useful for translating. But that Samaritan Pentateuch comes from the Second Temple period, like when Nehemiah and them come back and start to rebuild the temple, or Zerubbabel. And that's from anywhere from about 400 or 500 BC to the time of Jesus. So we don't have a definitive time on when it was written, but it's at least 2,000 years old, if not maybe up to 2,500 years old. So that's what they used for the Old Testament text for the New Living Translation. As far as the New Testament goes, they used a couple of the Greek New Testaments that we've become familiar with, that we've heard, the UBS Greek New Testament and the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament are the two sources that they used. And again, those Greek New Testaments that we mentioned right here are basically what they call a critical text, meaning that they sat down and they took a lot of different manuscripts of all of the biblical texts that they could get their hands on, and then they tried to, as best they could, formulate what the original author was trying to say with the text that they have available to them. And so they developed this Greek New Testament, and I left it sitting on my desk. I meant to bring it in here and let you see my Hebrew Bible and my Greek Bible. I can't read it. If you can, you can, but I can't. But it is kind of neat to see. If you open up the Hebrew one, don't start at the front cover like we would, because they read right to left. You have to start in what we consider the back of the book to actually look at it and see how. That's where the title page and everything is. It's really unusual compared to what we're used to. As far as the New Living Translation goes, though, it's like any other Bible translation. There was a purpose for why it was written, why it was translated, and it was created with the purpose of providing an easy-to-read modern version of the Bible. For those that have an NLT or use an NLT on regularity, is that a fair assessment, that it is easy to read in modern English? That is a very true. I've used it at times. It's one of the translations that I've read through all the way through, and that is a pretty good description. It is easy to read, and it is in modern English. I mean, that's the true description of it. Now, we always try to look at some interesting facts about the translation that we have before us. And so here is one interesting fact about the New Living Translation, is that items such as weights and measurements, dates and times are described in modern terms. Here's an example. In Sunday school, we were in Matthew chapter 25 this morning. And Terry was teaching us about the talents, the the guy who gave the talent, the king who gave the talents to 3 different people, the 1, 5, and 10 talents. And we talked about how, I made mention about how one talent is about 20 years worth of finances, 20 years worth of earnings. It's like 6,000 denarii. But anyway, we talked about that. Well, instead of saying 1 talent or 6,000 denarii or a day's wages or whatever, there would be a more modern concept. Now, it's not going to have it translated to, this many dollars and cents, but what it would do is it's going to put a lot of these things into a more modern context. And the good thing is, when the NLT does this, in the footnotes, they give what the literal translation is. So you're not going to be reading and it says that Noah built the ark and it was 450 cubits wide. I don't remember the number right offhand. Well, do you know what a cubit is? It's the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. Now, Elaine, I'm going to ask you to be my study guide for a minute. If you would stand with me for just a moment. And we're just going to both look this way, lean this way, okay? I'm going to have you put your arm out there straight. Is there a difference in a cubit there? Well, yeah. So for us in a modern context, we know that a cubit is typically about 18 inches. That's the average length that they used for a cubit. That's sort of the idea of it. But if you have someone like me with, extremely long arms versus someone who may have much shorter arms, there's going to be a difference in that length. So what they would probably say is that a cubit, instead of saying that it was 450 cubits, they would multiply it by 1.5 feet and figure out how many cubits long or wide or whatever it was. So here is an example of this. In John 6:7, it says this. This is about Jesus trying to feed the 5,000. It says, Philip replied, and this is from the NLT. It says, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. That's a pretty good description. In the New American Standard, it says this. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. And so that gives you an idea. They're going to say, instead of 200 denarii, they're going to say, we could work for months. And so it's that thought for thought. That gives you a little bit of an understanding about that thought for thought and how that works with these. And so another interesting fact about the New Living Translation is something we mentioned a few moments ago, that in 27 years there have been 4 revisions. Now, most of them, as I said, have been minor textual changes, but that is still something interesting, that you get to looking at the New King James Version, which is over 40 years old, and it has not had a single revision. And then you have the New Living Translation, which has been revised several times. It's almost, I don't know that this is the case, but it's almost like they're trying to get it better and better. Trying to make it a better refined version, I guess. I don't know what the exact reason for those changes would be. Another interesting thing, and this compares it with the New International Version, is that in July of 2008, the NLT was the best-selling Bible, and it actually dethroned the NIV for the first time in 20 years. And so the NIV had been, and still is, the best selling translation of the Bible. When it, they sell more copies of it than any other version in a year. But in 1 month in 2008, 15 years ago, there was 1 month when the New Living Translation, which had been out for 12 years at that point, sold more than the NIV, which is kind of interesting. But I don't know if the NIV has been dethroned since then, but I know that I came across that piece of information there. Well, one of the things we are doing each time, as we've talked about, is that we are comparing verses for the translation we're looking at to our 3 standards, the King James Version, the NIV, and the New American Standard Version. And so let's look tonight first at Deuteronomy 6:5. And whatever your translation is, it's going to look a little different. But you see here we have Deuteronomy 6:5. And you see that it says, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And again, that is the same thing that is relayed through the NIV and through the King James Version. But what we see is that instead of saying, like the NIV, love the Lord your God, the NLT is saying that you must love the Lord your God. And the King James Version said, and thou shalt, meaning that you shall love the Lord. It's the same thing, it's different semantics. Because if I tell you you will or you must, does it mean the same thing? It does. And so we see that in these. Now, the other one is the New American Standard Bible, and you see that it says, and you shall love the Lord your God. And so it's still that same idea. So even though the New Living Translation is thought for thought, do you see much difference there? There's not. It's really the word must, and that's really the big difference there. So let's look at our next verse, which is John 3:16. So when you read that, it says, for God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. Now let me ask you, if you were going to tell someone without quoting John 3:16 from a biblical translation, whether it is the King James Version or New King James, NIV or whatever, if you were going to explain John 3:16 to someone, does the NLT not sound about how you would explain it? God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son. And he did that so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. That sounds like what? It sounds like a paraphrase, doesn't it? That's not a bad thing, but it keeps the content, the thought of what John 3:16 is, it keeps it, and it's in a, as we said earlier, an easy to read and understand version of the Bible. And so that's one benefit to it, and we'll see that in a few moments. But you see that the context of the text is all there. So let's look at the other ones real quick. There, you see the NIV, so it is basically much the same way. And then the New American Standard Bible, if you'll show that one, Daryl. Again, it's very, very similar. And so the last verse that we have comes from Romans 12. And as we look at Romans 12:1, you see there, it says in the New Living Translation, and so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. Now that sounds a lot more like a paraphrase than a thought for thought, doesn't it? I mean, when you think about it, when we've looked at these others, because like the King James Version says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, and that's something else to pick up on. The original text, adelphoi, which is the Greek word for brothers, in other newer translations is being translated at times as brothers and sisters. And not that that is a bad thing, but it's helping to give context to the idea that believers are more than just men, or that believers can be more than just men. So go on to the next one for us. And this is the NIV. See, the NIV is using brothers and sisters as well. But the thought behind the NLT is more expansive. And so sometimes if you were to, I think this is easy to understand. If you go word for word, it's going to be more condensed, because you're going basically word for word. But if you have to give the thought of something, it's going to require more words, right? It's going to require more effort. It's going to require more text from you. So you see a little bit of the difference between the NIV and the NLT there. And then the last one we have is the NASB, again, using brothers and sisters. And you see that all three of these more modern translations are using the brothers and sisters. Even if they put it in brackets, they're still trying to get the idea across that it's not just the men that are being referred to here in Romans 12:1. And so that's the last verse that we're looking to compare tonight. And we're going to close out by looking at the pros and cons as we normally do. And the first pro that we have for the NLT is its readability. If you read the NLT, you read 3 verses right there. I read one to you earlier. When it comes to readability, the NLT is hands down probably the best English translation for its readability. And so it actually is considered by many to be one of the easiest to read English translations. That's not just your pastor saying that. That's many other people as well. Another pro to it is being able to understand the text. And the NLT is easy to read, which is good. And that means that if it's easy to read, then typically it should be easy for us to understand. It should be an easy translation to understand. And the thought-for-thought approach and the Living Bible paraphrase influence makes comprehension of the text simple and easy. That's a good thing. If you're wanting to understand what the biblical text says, that's a good thing. If we can't understand it, what good is it for us, right? If we don't understand what's being relayed through the biblical text, then what good is it to us? But there are some cons to the New Living Translation, and one of those is the influence of the Living Bible. With the Living Bible being a paraphrase, and being used as the English basis for the NLT, and the translation method of the NLT being thought for thought, it makes the NLT closer to being a paraphrase than a translation. It's not a paraphrase, but if you look on the chart that I've given you, if you look, is there any Bible any closer to being a paraphrase than the NLT? There isn't, is there? It is borderline being a paraphrase. Why? Because part of it is the English language Bible that was used was a paraphrase. Not only that, it's a thought for thought. So it's naturally going to be way over on the spectrum. And so that is a con for it. Another con is the fact that it is thought for thought and it's based off of a paraphrase means that the NLT is good for readability, but it's not necessarily the best resource for in-depth Bible study. And that's because sometimes what they relay as the thought for thought can lose something in translation instead of having something that is word for word. And so, plus being based on a paraphrase, that makes it harder to use when it comes to in-depth Bible study. But when it comes to readability and understanding it, that's sort of a trade-off that you get. The NLT would be great for daily reading. It'd be great for devotional reading and things like that. But when it comes to in-depth Bible study, there's probably other translations that would be better, I think is the best way to put it. And so that is the end of our study tonight on the New Living Translation. Next time that we're together, next Sunday, we will be looking at the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the HCSB. And I'm going to have to do a little digging to see. We may have to couple this with the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, depending on some things that I'm able to find out this week. And so it may just be the Holman Christian Standard Bible, or it may be the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the CSB. But that we will determine this week. Are there any questions about the New Living Translation and our study tonight? Heretical? Yeah. Right. 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 I understand. And, you see a lot of that. If you couldn't hear Patsy, what she was saying was that she remembers when the New Living Translation came out only 27 years ago. Remember that? Not too long ago. But when the New Living Translation came out, there were churches that, were all in an uproar over it, that it was heretical, that it was, they banned it, they didn't want to use it. And it left an impression on you, so to speak. And, the interesting thing is that you will find the same thing with the New International Version, even with most of the post-1900 Bibles. There are a lot of times, anytime there's a revision, there's people who are dug into the trenches on certain translations, whether it's King James Version or others, and they're like, I'm not going to use any other one than this one, and I don't like those others. And they'll be like, sometimes they're very aggressive about it, and they go to the point of wanting to ban some churches from using certain translations and stuff. But you find that not just with the NLT, you'll find it with the NIV, and I've heard more than one time the NIV should be called the nearly inspired version, and other things. And so you'll find that there are translations that, and the thing is, as we get to the CSB and the ESV and some of those, which are more modern, more new or newer translations of the Bible, you'll find that some people are just as in an uproar as they have been in the past over other new translations that have come out. And as we said when we looked at the King James Version starting out, there is some real eloquence to it, and there's pros and cons to it, just like there's pros and cons to every translation of the Bible. And so right. Right. And that's one of the things that I hope that you take away from this study is that that there are pros and cons to every translation of the Bible. There is, whether it's the King James all the way up to the most recent, which is probably the CSB. There are pros and cons to every one, and that's what I want you to. And what I want you to find through this series is that if the translation that you're used to using, whether it's the King James Version, the New King James, or NIV or whatever, if the translation that you have been using is the right one for you, then guess what? Your pastor wants you to keep using it. I don't want you to switch a translation just because I told you ought to. Because you know what? I'm human just like everybody else, and I am not the one speaking through the Word of God. God is. And so I want you to use the Bible that speaks to you, and the Bible that you can understand, and the Bible that you can study with. And so whether it's the King James Version or any other translation, I want you to find the one that works best for you and that helps you the best to understand what God is trying to relay through His Word. And so if that means when this study's over, you're like, Pastor, I've always been a New King James Version person, but I really think I'm going to start using the ESV or the CSB or whatever, then guess what? I encourage you to do that. I hope that you will and see. And you may get to reading and you're like, you know what? I got to go back to the New King James. Well, go back to the New King James. But the key is to find a Bible that you'll use, a Bible that you'll read, a Bible that you will apply to your life and dig into it. That's the key. And so thank you for both of you ladies for sharing that. And it is a challenge that because the King James Version, and I don't mean this in a bad way, the King James Version had a stranglehold on Christianity for going on 300 years. There is a lot of clout there that it has with a lot of people and a lot of churches. And so that clout or power is a hard thing to overcome. Not that you have to, not that we need to, dethrone King James and get rid of it, but there is a lot to it that is hard to get people to see, hey, there might be a better translation for you as an individual. And that's what I hope understanding the text and where they get their text from helps you understanding that there's newer discoveries than what they had 400 years ago that help us better understand the biblical text, therefore helps us have a more modern translation. So, um, I, I don't know that King James was Catholic. He may have been, but him being the King of England, he would have been the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So it would be, to me, it would be kind of unusual for him to be a Catholic. He might have been. I don't know. I would have to try and find that out. But there are at times, translations that older translations like the Bishop's Bible and some of the others that were about the same time as the King James Version, that had a lot of Catholic influence because the Catholic Church, had a lot of influence back then on religion and Christianity in general. And so, any other questions or thoughts? Those are great ones. Yes, ma'am. They're not there, right? Um, Right. The it's not so much that it's based on the original text that they're using, and we've talked about this at times that um, there's four different ancient texts that are used, and when I say ancient texts, it's like basically where they were found and how many of them were found in this area or that area, and there were were called Byzantine and Alexandrian. The Byzantine are what the King James Version used. But those Byzantine texts were copied, and the oldest versions they have of the Byzantine um, Greek and Hebrew text are from like the 900s to even up into the 1700s. They were copied and made between 900 AD and 16 or 1700 AD. And that's what the King James used because that's all they had access to. And you can't make a translation off of anything other than what you have access to. Well, the NIV, the New King James, the NIV and the New American Standard, NLT, and all those use what are called the Alexandrian text. And those Alexandrian texts are actually from an older time period. They're from like the 200s, maybe even the late 100s AD up until about 500 AD. And so they're an older text, meaning that they are closer to the original text. We don't have any autograph signed copies of Ephesians or anything like that. But what that tells us is the ones that are older in age are closer to the original. And so the King James and the New King James use the Byzantine, which are from the 900s to 1600s. But the NIV and others use those older texts. And what that means is that the reason we would, like what you said, leaving a verse out, is because those older texts didn't have those. Those older texts didn't have the same text that those Byzantine would have. And so that's why there's at times there looks to be a discrepancy between King James and other translations. It's because they've used different ones. And the good thing for us is that if we use a more modern translation like the NIV and others, is there have been a lot of discoveries. In the 1890s, there were like 10,000 Hebrew scriptures or manuscripts that were found. You've got the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've got some at Masada, I think, is another place, where they have found manuscripts that they didn't have in 1611 just simply by the fact that they hadn't been discovered. And so those newer discoveries help us evaluate the original text in a new way. And so that helps us out to determine, okay, what was the author, the writer of Ephesians, Paul, what was he trying to relay through this? And so they would use those newer discoveries and those ancient texts, which are 1,800 years old, to determine what they use. And so a lot of times too, if you look in the NIV or other translations, a lot of times what they'll say on those verses where they're not there where they might be in the King James Version, a lot of times they'll put at the bottom that other ancient manuscripts say this. And they'll tell you what you'll find in the King James and the New King James. So that was a whole lot to be said that I hope answers the question. But that's a good question. I enjoy that question as well. Any other questions this evening? That might be the case, Rob. You don't agree with him then, right, Peggy? Yeah. All right. Well, appreciate you being here this evening. If there's not any other questions, then we'll adjourn. If you do have other questions, feel free to ask them. I'll be glad to try and answer them as best I know. And if not, I'll go and look it up and hopefully have an answer next week. And so, thanks for being here tonight. Just a reminder that we'll be in here on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We do have a missionary that's going to share with us for a few moments before we get into our Bible study, finishing out the book of Galatians. And so, be here on Wednesday night for that. Don't forget the weekly meal is at 6 o'clock, and so I hope that you'll be here for that. I'm cooking this week. I'm using my Uncle Domino's recipe, and so I think our team, because I'm supposed to be the point person, but Misty and Johanna and Savannah are the real brains behind our operation, and I think that Domino's is where we're getting our pizza from this week. So I think that's where they've decided. So we'll be doing that this week for the meal, and salad. And so come out for that. Next Sunday morning we'll be back in our study on spiritual warfare, looking at what's at stake when it comes to spiritual warfare. And so with that being said, I'm going to ask Ken if he would to close us out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.